Still, it might reasonably be maintained by the modern mind that he is hampered in describing human evil and sorrow by this inability to imagine tedium, this dullness in the matter of dullness. For, after all, it is certainly true that the worst part of the lot of the unfortunate is the fact that they have long spaces in which to review the irrevocability of their doom. It is certainly true that the worst days of the oppressed man are the 9 days out of 10 in which he is not oppressed. This sense of sickness and sameness Dickens did certainly fail or refuse to give. When we read such a description as that excellent one, in detail, of Dotheboys Hall, we feel that, while everything else is accurate, the author does, in his words of the excellent Captain Nares in Stevenson's Wrecker, draw the dreariness rather mild. The boys at Dotheboys were perhaps less bullied, but they were certainly more bored. For, indeed, how could anyone be bored with the society of so sumptuous a creature as Mr. Squeers? Who would not put up with a few illogical floggings in order to enjoy the conversation of a man who could say, "She's a rum 'un, is nature"? Nature is more easier conceived than described. The same principle applies to the workhouse in Oliver Twist. We feel vaguely that neither Oliver nor anyone else could be entirely unhappy in the presence of the purple personality of Mr. Bumble. The one thing he did not describe in any of the abuses he denounced was the soul-destroying potency of routine. He made out the bad school, the bad parochial system, the bad debtors' prison, as very much jollier and more exciting than they may really have been. In a sense, then, he flattered them, but he destroyed them with the flattery. By making Mrs. Gamp delightful, he made her impossible. He gave every one an interest in Mr. Bumble's existence, and by the same act gave every one an interest in his destruction. It would be difficult to find a stronger instance of the utility and energy of the method which we have, for the sake of argument, called the method of the optimistic reformer. As long as Low Yorkshire schools were entirely colourless and dreary, they continued quietly tolerated by the public and quietly intolerable to the victims. So long as Squeers was dull as well as cruel, he was permitted. The moment he became amusing as well as cruel, he was destroyed. As long as Bumble was merely inhuman, he was allowed. When he became human, humanity wiped him right out. For in order to do these great acts of justice, we must always realize not only the humanity of the oppressed, but even the humanity of the oppressor. The satirist had, in a sense, to create the images in the mind before, as an iconoclast, he could destroy them. Dickens had to make Squeers live before he could make him die. In connection with the accusation of vulgar optimism, which I have taken as a text for this chapter, there is another somewhat odd thing to notice. Nobody in the world was ever less optimistic than Dickens in his treatment of evil or the evil man. When I say optimist in this matter, I mean optimism in the modern sense of an attempt to whitewash evil. Nobody ever made less attempt to whitewash evil than Dickens. Nobody black was ever less white than Dickens's black. He painted his villains and lost characters more black than they really are. He crowds his stories with a kind of villain rare in modern fiction, the villain really without any redeeming point. There is no redeeming point in Squeers, or in Monks, or in Ralph Nickleby, or in Bill Sykes, or in Quilp, or in Brass, or in Mr. Chester, or in Mr. Pecksniff, or in Jonas Chuzzlewit, or in Cracker, or in Uriah Heep, or in Blandois, or in 100 more. So far as the balance of good and evil in human characters is concerned, Dickens certainly could not be called a vulgar optimist. His emphasis on evil was melodramatic. He might be called a vulgar pessimist. Some will dismiss this lurid villainy as a detail of his artificial romance. I am not inclined to do so. He inherited undoubtedly this unqualified villain, as he inherited so many other things from the whole history of European literature. But he breathed into the blackguard a peculiar and vigorous life of his own. He did not show any tendency to modify his blackguardism in accordance with the increasing considerateness of the age. He did not seem to wish to make his villain less villainous. He did not wish to imitate the analysis of George Eliot or the reverent scepticism of Thackeray. And all this works back, I think, to a real thing in him, that he wished to have an obstreperous and incalculable enemy. He wished to keep alive the idea of combat, which means of necessity a combat against something individual and alive. I do not know whether, in the kindly rationalism of his epoch, he kept any belief in a personal devil in his theology, but he certainly created a personal devil in every one of his books. A good example of my meaning can be found, for instance, in such a character as Quilp. Dickens may, for all I know, have had originally some idea of describing Quilp as the bitter and unhappy cripple, a deformity whose mind is stunted along with his body. But if he had such an idea, he soon abandoned it. Quilp is not in the least unhappy. His whole picturesqueness consists in the fact that he has a kind of hellish happiness, an atrocious hilarity that makes him go bounding about like an Indian rubber ball. Quilp is not in the least bitter. He has an unaffected gaiety, an expansiveness, and universality. He desires to hurt people in the same hearty way that a good-natured man desires to help them. He likes to poison people with the same kind of clamorous camaraderie with which an honest man likes to stand them drink. Quilp is not in the least stunted in mind. He is not in reality even stunted in body. His body, that is, does not in any way fall short of what he wants it to do. His smallness gives him rather the promptitude of a bird or the precipitance of a bullet. In a word, Quilp is precisely the devil of the Middle Ages. He belongs to that amazingly healthy period when even lost spirits were hilarious. This heartiness and vivacity in the villains of Dickens is worthy of note, because it is directly connected with his own cheerfulness. This is a truth little understood in our time, but it is a very essential one. If optimism means a general approval, it is certainly true that the more a man becomes an optimist, the more he becomes a melancholy man. If he manages to praise everything, his praise will develop an alarming resemblance to a polite boredom. He will say that the marsh is as good as the garden. He will mean that the garden is as dull as the marsh. He may force himself to say that emptiness is good, but he would hardly prevent himself from asking, what is the good of such good? This optimism does exist, this optimism which is more hopeless than pessimism, this optimism which is the very heart of hell. Against